In January 1879, a Zulu warrior and his regiment, along with 7 other regiments, were instructed by the Zulu king to push an army of British soldiers back across the Umzanyati River and back to where they had come from. The British had crossed into the Zulu kingdom from the colony of Natal, which was under their control at the time. So about 20,000 Zulus set up camp in a valley which is very close to the camp where this invading army is staying, and they just sit there. They had planned on attacking the camp within the next few days, but all of a sudden, a few of their scouts who had been scoping out the camp come running down into the valley, and they're being chased by men from the camp on horses who start shooting at them. And seeing this, the warrior and all of the other warriors immediately jump up and start running after these men, who are still shooting at them as they ride away towards the camp. This would culminate in a battle which would shake the British Empire to the core and enrage the British public, the Battle of Isandlwana. So, back in the 1870s, the British Empire was well on its way to colonizing almost all of southern Africa. They had already taken Cape Colony, or South Africa, from the Dutch back in 1806, and had taken a ton of land in southern Africa, but the British, being the ambitious colonizers they were, wanted more land. Now there was this small kingdom called the Zulu Kingdom, which was right next to the colony of South Africa, and it was ruled by a guy named Cetshwayo, who was the half-nephew of Shaka Zulu, who had founded the Zulu Kingdom in 1806. Fast forward to December 1878, and the British presented Cetshwayo with an ultimatum that basically said, hey, you need to disband your army and step down as king. Oh, and you need to do it in 30 days. What they were trying to do here was give the Zulus an ultimatum they literally could not agree to in order to start a war with them and take that land for themselves. Cetshwayo never responded to this ultimatum, and I can imagine that this was because the terms literally made no sense. They were literally asking a sovereign nation, an independent nation that had existed for more than 70 years, to basically hang up their weapons and submit to the British. Diamonds and other natural resources had been found in and around the area where the Zulu Kingdom was, and the British wanted to take Zululand not only to take these natural resources for themselves, but they wanted the Zulu population to provide labor for these diamond fields. So of course, after those 30 days had passed, the British army marched in 3 different columns into the Zulu Kingdom in January 1879. Now Cetshwayo did not want to fight the British. He had actually assembled an army of about 40,000 men, but he did not want them to engage the British and start a war. What he had actually wanted to do was stay defensive and only fight if it was absolutely necessary, because he wanted to negotiate peace with them and avoid any kind of bloodshed. Now the British, on the other hand, absolutely wanted to fight. Lord Chelmsford, who was the commander of this army that had advanced into the Zulu Kingdom, thought to himself, hey, the Zulus are a bunch of warriors with spears and shields. Surely they aren't a match for our rifles and cannons. And so on the 22nd of January, he advanced with this column in order to attack what he thought was the Zulu army, leaving a large number of his men in an unfortified position at the bottom of a mountain called Isandlwana. Isandlwana is a mountain in South Africa which could be seen from a nearby British supply depot called Rorke's Drift, which the British had established at a Swedish missionary camp when they had first entered the Zulu Kingdom. They had decided to set up a camp at the foot of Isandlwana because Chelmsford had gotten word from his scouts that the Zulu army had been seen a little ways in the distance, and so he takes his column and heads towards where he believes the Zulu army are. But little did he know, this was a ruse by the Zulus, who were camped out about 7 miles away in a valley called the Umbambi Valley. When he had left about 1,800 of his men at this unfortified position at the bottom of Isandlwana, and they were basically sitting ducks. In front of them was this huge open field with little to no cover. What Chelmsford should have had them do was logger the place up, which basically means form a circle with a bunch of big wagons around the camp in order to make it harder for the Zulus to get to them if they did attack. But Chelmsford genuinely thought that setting up a logger was not necessary, and that if there was a Zulu attack, the British firepower would be enough to wipe them out, because again, these were a bunch of warriors with spears and shields, and the firearms they did have were outdated. They'd stockpiled muzzle loaders and muskets from previous battles with the Boers, but they had not regularly cleaned them or kept them in fighting condition. So as the Umbambi warrior and the rest of the Zulu army charged out of the valley after the horsemen still shoot at them as they're riding away, trying to do anything they can to not get overwhelmed by this massive Zulu army, which they probably figured already knew about the camp. These horsemen obviously get away. They were on horses and the Zulus were not, and so the Zulus start their advance towards the camp at Isandlwana. As they're getting closer, they start forming their traditional buffalo horns battle formation that they had been using since Shaka invented it during his reign a few decades before. The way this works is that different divisions are divided into 4 different parts of the buffalo. 1 or 2 regiments will form the left horn, another few will form the right horn, another few form the chest, and another few form the loins. And seeing this massive Zulu army of 20,000 men moving towards the camp, the British lieutenant colonel who had been left in charge of the camp, Henry Pauline, sent all 6 regiments of the 24th Foot Company out into the open field to engage the center column, or chest, of the Zulu army. Now, the idea behind the buffalo horn strategy the Zulus were using is that as they're moving towards their enemy, the divisions making up the chest will charge the enemy straight on and engage them. The chest is generally made up of the toughest warriors who had seen combat before and could hold their own in a fight. They were tasked with engaging the enemy head-on. Both the left and the right horns will break off from the main army and try to curve around the enemy force on both sides, encircling them. The left and right horns were made up of younger warriors who were quicker and more agile. The loins functioned mostly as reserves, with mostly older and more experienced warriors to be used only when it was necessary. So the Umbambi Warriors Regiment is part of the chest of the buffalo, and so they're approaching this division of British soldiers head-on, and as they get closer, they break into a charge. The British from the 24th started firing at them, and all the warriors who were in front of him just kept falling and falling, and the ones who were behind them were literally tripping over the bodies of their fallen comrades. The cowhide shields they were using did nothing to stop the high-caliber rounds of the British standard-issue Martini Henry rifle. As this is happening, the warrior can see the left horn of the buffalo formation kind of curve around the small hill where the British are, and the British were forced to fall back and take cover in a small donga, which is basically a small ravine that the soldiers could climb down into in order to give themselves more cover, and they fire at the Umbambi regiment from there. So while the left horn is closing the circle in order to fully trap the British, the warriors' regiment cannot advance because they are being faced with very heavy gunfire from the donga. The warrior looks to the north side of the British encampment, and he can see the Camp Vendu regiment is being driven back by soldiers who were under the command of Colonel Anthony Durnford. These soldiers were not highly experienced regulars like the 24th Foot Division. They were African troops who did not have the Martini Henry rifles the 24th had, but outdated muzzle-loading rifles that couldn't fire at the same rate as the Martini Henry. As these warriors are falling back to escape the bayonets and the gunfire, one of the sub-chiefs of the Camp Vendu regiment runs down from the hill just above where his division was fighting, and he yells at his troops to fight, or they would get the entire army killed. This was a common practice among the Zulus as a way of getting the warriors to fight if they showed any sign of hesitation or unwillingness to engage the enemy. And it worked. The warriors shouted Usutu, a Zulu war cry, and charged the British with full force, not stopping no matter how many men in front of them were cut down. The chief was shot in the head and fell to the ground, but the warriors just ran over his body and engaged the British head-on, stabbing them with their spears and forcing them all the way back into basically the main camp, where all the tents and supplies were. And then the soldiers in the donga saw that the Camp Vendu regiment had gotten behind them, so they retreated back to the camp, and while they did so, they continued to fire at the Umbambi regiment and the rest of the center regiments behind them. Durnford's company also started to retreat, but in doing so they left the flank of the 24th G Company exposed, and this company was overrun and slaughtered by the Zulu warriors. This was the Umbambi and the rest of the center's moment to strike. The Umbambi warrior and the rest of the centers started advancing quickly, and they start fighting their way towards the camp, slaughtering every redcoat in their way, and while they're fighting, the sky darkened and turned black, and the entire battlefield became virtually dark. This was a solar eclipse that just happened to occur while all this fighting was going on. So all these soldiers are fighting it out in this camp with very little light, and when it became light again, it was like a scene out of an apocalypse movie. All the tents had collapsed, and what was left of the British were fighting back to back, jabbing at the Zulus with their bayonets, just trying anything to stay alive, but most of them were either stabbed or clubbed to death by the ruthless Zulus. There were so many Zulus in the camp just knocking and stabbing the hell out of these poor men that it was all over before the Umbambi warrior had even made it to where it was all happening. But a small number of British had escaped. The buffalo horns of the Zulu didn't actually circle the British camp completely. Colonel Durnford and a small force of native soldiers were able to keep both horns from completely circling the camp by defending a small wagon park at the edge of the camp. Some British soldiers managed to escape to Rorke's Drift, mounted men were able to escape across the river, and others escaped into the hills but were hunted down and killed by the Zulus. These men were outright killed and not tortured, as torture was against Zulu custom. After the battle was over and all the British were either dead or had escaped, the Zulus looked around the camp for water or anything to drink. They had just fought a battle in the hot sun and probably hadn't had anything to drink since before the battle, and some of them didn't even check to see what they were drinking. Some found paraffin oil and drank it, and of course, they got sick from it. Others found bottles of tiwala, which was a native beer, and got drunk. They also took rifles from dead soldiers, which they would use against the British in later engagements. In total, the British lost 1,329 men, including 52 officers, 806 regulars, and 471 native African soldiers, while the Zulu lost about 2,000. The total number of Zulu dead can't be confirmed because the Zulus didn't do their own body count. Chelmsford was blamed for the loss, and rightly so, and his reputation was badly damaged. Even though he would go on to lead the British to victory in the war, he was never the commander of an army again. The causes of the British loss weren't just that Chelmsford had a big ego problem. It was also discovered that the ammunition boxes were nailed down and could not be opened easily. This is obviously a problem when you have an army of 20,000 Zulu warriors charging towards you and you can only carry so much ammunition on your person. While this was a great victory for the Zulus, they had still lost many men, and they would lose many more later on the same day when they attacked the small outpost at Rorke's Drift. 4,000 Zulus from the army that had just won at Isandlwana detached from the main army and went on to attack Rorke's Drift. They would fail, as the 150 British regulars at the camp held them off in a heroic display, with the Zulus losing a confirmed 351 men and the British only 17. This battle would be made even more famous by the 1964 movie Zulu, directed by Cy Enfield. The war would go on until July, and during this time the British would beat the Zulus several more times, inflicting thousands of casualties, and in the end they burned the Zulu capital of Ulundi, exiled King Sechwao to London, and made Zululand a British protectorate until it was eventually absorbed into the colony of Natal in 1897, and today it's a part of the South African province KwaZulu-Natal. Today you can still visit the battlefield at Isandlwana, which is about 105 miles northwest of the city of Durban in South Africa. There are still mass graves of soldiers, which are marked by cairns, piles of stones that are used to mark landmarks, mass graves, or anything of significant importance. In these graves are fathers, sons, brothers, nephews, uncles, and others who died either running towards gunfire while their comrades fell in front of them one after the other while trying to defend their homeland, or those who joined up with the military seeking adventure, only to be speared or clubbed alongside their own brothers, far from home, under the hot sun, fighting for their country's selfish ambitions to colonize and basically enslave the people of Africa.